Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our virtual lessons for AP Environmental Science. My name is Dr. Sowell, and I teach APES at Darnell Cookman Middle High School here in Jacksonville, Florida. So just to get our brains warmed up, we're going to revisit what Miss Fassler ended with last time. She was in the middle of or not in the middle, but she was finishing up her conversation about bioaccumulation and biomagnification and talking about mercury. So we know that that's part of electronic waste or e-waste, any kind of discarded electronic devices, televisions, computers, cell phones, things like that. So we're going to pick up with the FRQ that she introduced right there at the end the other day. So it says 30 million mobile devices were sold in '98. The number sold increased to 180 million devices in 2007. Discarded mobile devices became part of the electronic waste stream, e-stream. Mercury is often present in e-waste. So there's three parts to this question. First one is just an identify a negative human health effect, and then two calculations. So let's go over the answers to those really quickly. So the first one was identify a negative health effect other than death associated with exposure to mercury. So we see all those neurological problems, kidney damage, vision impairment, paralysis, Minamata disease. I will say that Minamata disease is a really fascinating case study of bioaccumulation and biomagnification and mercury. So I would highly suggest just Googling that, going on YouTube and see what you see about Minamata disease, really fascinating. So that was worth 1 point, just to identify. The second one is a calculation. So remember that you have to determine which type of method you're going to use, and then you have to apply some mathematical work and then get an answer with appropriate units. So this question says each mobile device contained 0.03 grams of gold. Calculate the number of grams of gold that were used in production of mobile devices sold in 2007. So we knew there was 180 million devices. Each device had about 0.03 grams of gold. And that results in the devices canceling out the way we set up our dimensional analysis. Always remember, when you're doing calculations, have a unit every single place you can, and the dimensional analysis setup will help you to cancel out units, and that leaves you with 5,400,000 grams. The second part of this said, assume that the average mass of each device was 0.1 kilogram. The EPA estimates that about 10% of the mobile devices sold were recycled. So now we want to know, what is the mass of the mobile devices that were not recycled? So that would mean the other 90%. So we have 180 million devices. Each device has a mass of 0.1 kilograms. And we are interested in 90% of that because we know 10% was recycled. So again, our device unit cancels, and we're left with 16,200,000 kilograms. All right, now we've got our brain warmed up in our APESy way. Let's jump into today. So here's our goals for today. Number 1, solid waste disposal. Number 2, waste reduction methods. And number 3, sewage treatment. So this is coming from topics 8, 9, and 10. And again, we're going to revisit practice number 2, visual representations, and how we can use those images in environmental science. So overall, my goal of today is for you to leave the next, or once we're done here, to be able to talk about where does the toilet go and where does the trash go. So we have processes that are very interesting to talk about. So again, what happens after the flush and what happens after the throwaway. So before we get starting into this topic, though, I would suggest reviewing a few things just so that you're comfortable with the conversations we're having today. This will be a really great review of the hydrologic cycle because there are some issues with groundwater that we're going to discuss today. Also fossil fuels. We're going to talk about, in particular, methane, which we know is a main component of natural gas. So be sure you remember how natural gas is turned into electricity. And finally, soil composition and properties. Some of the physical characteristics of different soil textures are going to come into play here. So that would be another great thing to loop back in and review. So let's jump right into it. The first thing is solid waste disposal. So here we've got a picture of a dumpster. Looks like they're cleaning out someone's house or garage, and we see lots of plastic bags full of stuff, paper bags, some wood, who knows what else is there. If we are going to quote unquote get rid of this, where does it go? And that's our question today, is what happens to it? So by the end of this section, you'll be able to describe solid waste disposal methods. To get there, we are going to define what solid waste is. It's a basic definition. We'll learn about a sanitary municipal landfill where most of our garbage goes. And then also solid waste incineration, which in some places is what they do with the solid waste. And finally, we'll look at some illegal ocean dumping and some of the very specific environmental consequences it results in. So what's solid waste? It's waste that's solid. It's not a liquid or a gas, it's solid waste. And it can come from a lot of different places, from industry, from agriculture, from your home. For the scope of what we can cover today, I'm really going to focus only on municipal solid waste, because that's what I generated this morning. That's what you generated today. That municipal or city waste, our everyday garbage and trash. So where does that stuff go? It goes to a landfill. And I'll be honest with you, before I started teaching this class, I don't think I really had a strong understanding of the anatomy of the landfill and how the structure of the landfill design actually helps to mitigate some of the environmental effects of a landfill. So hopefully by the end of today, you'll understand why we build landfills the way we do, and then some of the environmental consequences that still exist. So in order to define what a landfill is, I think it's really useful to contrast that with something like an open dump. Just a place where people might be throwing trash. So this is not a landfill. This is not regulated. There is no oversight to this. It's trash on the side of the road or in a field somewhere. And there's some very specific problems associated with that we can then try to solve with a landfill. So the first one is smell. Obviously, it's going to stink. It's decomposing material, visually unappealing. No, this is not exactly someone's ideal vacation destination. And also trash. If there's a big wind, some of the stuff is going to blow all over the place and become litter. If this starts to catch on fire, this could be a real environmental and human health hazard that we should avoid. Vermin, love that word, vermin. Just kind of any little pests that might be around, rats or mosquitoes, or in this case, something like pigs, animals that might be coming in, and some of those animals might be carrying diseases. The last two is methane and groundwater contamination. So methane getting into the atmosphere and something from this dump actually contaminating our groundwater. So I want to focus quite a bit here at the beginning on those two particular environmental problems associated with a dump. So let's look at this dump. So this is not a landfill. This would be just this orange dome would kind of represent this open dump where we've dumped all this trash. And I want you to imagine the dark brown dots as pollutants or toxins. All it takes is a good rain, and rain is going to percolate down through the landfill. And as it goes, it's going to grab onto and pull out those toxins and pollutants. Those toxins or pollutants are going to leach out. And so therefore the resulting liquid is called leachate. Well, from your understanding of the hydrologic cycle, remember that groundwater can be contaminated from surface water. So this water that has percolated all the way through the landfill is now going to continue to travel and recharge maybe our drinking aquifer or another body of groundwater. But now that leachate is contaminating that water as well. So this is clearly a problem of an unregulated open dump. Another problem is methane. So here's our dump again, and here's our trash. And eventually the microorganisms that are decomposing this trash are going to run out of oxygen. This is going to be squished and compressed way down, but it's not going to be finished decomposing. And so what's going to start happening is anaerobic decomposition. So in the absence of oxygen, one of the main byproducts of anaerobic decomposition is methane. So methane is going to be generated in this landfill, get into the atmosphere, where we know it is going to be one of the major greenhouse gases. So this is going to be implicated in climate change. So definitely recognize that landfills are a significant contributor methane. So we're talking about an open dump here, but even a landfill has these problems. So based on that list of problems, we designed a sanitary landfill. It's where we put most of our solid waste here in the United States. However, we still have the issue of groundwater contamination and harmful methane release. So what do we do to work with some of those problems? Let's just look at this diagram. And the first thing I want to highlight is this: portable fences used to catch windblown debris. There we go. There's one way to eliminate that windblown trash or litter. And then we see that every day after the trash is unloaded and pushed into little piles, it's compacted and covered daily with soil to keep out vermin and reduce odor. So it's almost like a cake, like a layer of trash, layer of soil, layer of trash, layer of soil. And that layer of soil keeps out the vermin and regulates the odor a little bit. And then we also get these large pipes, and it says pipes sunk through compacted layers collect the methane gas to either burn it off or convert it into energy. So we just talked about how methane is a problem in a dump. So in a landfill, a lot of that methane is captured and used later. And down here it says part of the drain grid, perforated drains collect leachate for treatment. So at the very bottom of the landfill, we're going to have these perforated pipes in which that leachate that has infiltrated and percolated all the way down into these pipes can be collected. Finally, at the bottom, it says layers of compacted clay and high density plastic liners protect the groundwater. Why clay though? So if you remember back to the physical properties of soil, we remember that clay has very low permeability. So it is going to act as a really nice boundary between the leachate and the groundwater. So a layer of plastic and clay is a great lining for the bottom of a landfill. So let's just take a look at those issues of odor, visually unappealing, trash and litter, fires, vermin, groundwater contamination, and methane. We've solved a lot of these, and some we've made a lot less of an impact. However, 16% of all the methane emissions in the United States still come from landfills. So landfills are still a very significant source of methane, which again is a greenhouse gas. You may notice that the one category above that is called enteric fermentation. It's an odd phrase if it's not familiar to you. And again, that's just if you remember from our discussion of livestock and meat production, that methane is a byproduct of the digestive system of these ruminants, these cattle. So now we come to a unique thing, tires. So it's not something you'd think about, but tires can't be recycled too well into new tires once they're old and not used anymore. So they get thrown away a lot. And unfortunately, they sometimes gather at the top of landfills. And if they catch on fire, an incredibly bad source of air pollution. So a lot of times landfills will not take tires, or if they do take them, they'll require them to be shredded really finely before use. But that's not the only bad part of tires laying around either in a dump or a landfill. And it has to do with mosquitoes. If you think about it, that space in between the two sides of the tire can collect rainwater, and that stagnant rainwater becomes a really great breeding ground for mosquitoes. So you see those mosquito larvae in the top left doing their cute little up and down dance, getting oxygen. But a single tire could breed several mosquitoes, and then thousands of tires in one place, you could see, would have a very negative impact, especially in terms of diseases like malaria or Zika. So if you think about all of that methane, you should be starting to connect that to natural gas and think, well, maybe we could use that. Absolutely, we can. Some places will actually collect the methane and use it to generate electricity. So just as a reminder from our unit on electricity, when we're taking a fossil fuel like coal, oil, or natural gas and turning that into electricity, we typically follow a series of steps that you should be able to describe. So first of all, we have to collect and transport this methane. So we've got these pipes and systems by which we can do that, collect it and transport it. Then we got to burn it. The heat from that is going to boil water to make steam or hot air. And that steam is going to spin the turbine, and that's going to rotate a generator to generate electricity. Okay, so be sure that you can not only describe the process by which the electricity is generated, but also understand the source of the methane from that anaerobic decomposition within the landfill. So we're going to show a couple of minute clip here, just as a nice overview of what we've talked about.
Finding a suitable site for a landfill can be complex. Landfill operators will work with regulators to be sure the new facility is located in the right place. Some places, like properties near wetlands, will be carefully evaluated for any environmental concerns. Impacts on nearby traffic will be analyzed. The site will also be evaluated to understand the land, groundwater, and surface water in the vicinity. Community feedback is important to consider, and meeting environmental and land use standards are a must. Once the site is approved by the regulator, the first step is to follow permit plans for sound construction. The second step is to secure the base of the landfill to provide a stable base for the liner. A two-phase composite liner is installed on the base and sides of the landfill. Leachate, a natural occurrence when waste is in contact with water, is collected through a system of drains, pumps, pipes, and hoses that move leachate away from the landfill. The leachate collection system will act as an effective biological filter by removing excess moisture from the bottom of the landfill. A groundwater monitoring system is installed to ensure the landfill does not impact groundwater at the site. The monitoring system acts as an alert in case additional measures may be needed to protect neighboring properties. Groundwater quality is protected at all times. Access to the site is carefully controlled for safety, and waste is screened by appropriateness as required. The landfill is ready to receive waste that has not been recycled. Equipment compacts the waste each day before daily cover, soil or tarps, is placed to avoid potential littering and odor. Gas wells are installed to capture methane generated by the waste. Once full, the landfill is covered with a cover system approved by the regulator. Groundwater continues to be monitored, and methane gas is collected and destroyed or turned into energy or fuel. When the landfill stops accepting waste, regulators will approve its closure and will monitor its safety for 30 years or as required by the regulators. Then, controls will be put in place to keep the property secure for the future. The property surrounding a closed landfill can be used for commercial or industrial use. But commonly, the property is used for green space, suitable for recreation or habitat conservation. We strongly support wildlife habitat conservation at our landfills through our partnership with the Wildlife Habitat Council.
So, the volume of stuff, of solid waste in a landfill is an issue. The more solid waste in the landfill, the more methane that's going to be generated, the more leachate that's going to be generated. And those two things we have to deal with. So anything that we can do to reduce the volume of solid waste in the landfill is something we should explore. And one of those ways, which is pretty common, is incineration. So many places around the world will burn the solid waste instead of sending it to a landfill. The majority of our solid waste here in the United States still goes to a landfill, but incineration is not uncommon. Clearly, the first thing that should pop into your mind as soon as we hear about us burning something or combusting something is air pollution. So while the pro is it reduces the volume, we now have to deal with the subsequent air pollution that comes out of the smokestacks. So this last part of where our solid waste goes, we're really going to look at something a little bit more nefarious and illegal. So some countries dispose of their waste by dumping it in the ocean. Now, certain countries have laws against that and some don't, but this practice has led to a lot of plastic in the ocean. And you can see this is a picture of a beach somewhere with lots of plastic pollution all on the beach. Well, while it might be unsightly and an environmental problem here on shore, it has a very specific and dangerous consequence to wildlife. So we're going to take a look at a clip from the United Nations that really talks about this concept of plastic pollution in the ocean. I will warn you, towards the end of the video, there is a dissection of a seabird, and we're looking at some of the plastic it has eaten. So if that kind of image makes you a little squeamish, feel free to turn away for those moments or skip the video.
Garbage thrown away in the United States can make its way to Antarctica. Plastic in our coastal waters is pulled into the centre of massive wind-driven, churning circular gyres. There are many other ocean currents also diverting the trash all around the surface of the ocean. In reality, it's just one ocean with no boundaries. Lord Howe Island is a World Heritage Site and home to migratory seabirds like the shearwater. Seabirds are incredibly helpful because they act like an army of scientists. They travel thousands of miles across the ocean. They pick up plastic off the surface of the ocean. They bring it back to their rookeries where they feed it to their chicks. And that provides an incredible amount of scientific data in terms of where the plastic comes from, its distribution, and how it breaks up on the ocean surface. Dr. Jennifer Lavers, she's devoted her life to studying the plight of seabirds. Shearwaters are incredible birds. They migrate thousands of miles, stopping only here to breed.
Yeah, the stomach is very, very full. And if we look here, there's some very dark pieces, some very light white pieces. And if you see, as I push on this, it's absolutely rigid, completely full of plastic all the way up.
Oh, look at that.
Absolutely no doubt that this bird died as a result of that plastic. That is literally a gut full of plastic. It's quite alarming, isn't it?
Oh, that's awful.
Range of plastic types and colours. We've got everything from the blues and the reds
His
to the
stomach's just filled with it. Big pieces too.
big
Like
sharp
heavy.
pieces.
Oh, wow, look at the size of that big black piece.
That is an enormous piece of plastic.
Unbelievable. Look at the size of that. Jen, I counted 234 pieces of plastic out of that one bird.
So you can see a lot of really dramatic footage there of this plastic becoming part of this bird's diet.
Is that
So we really got to think about our single-use plastics and what are they doing to the environment. A lot of the single-use plastics, like a plastic bag that we might use in a grocery store, while that has a purpose perhaps in our daily life, it may have some negative consequences beyond our use of it. So we're really going to look at two ways that we could maybe reduce the amount of solid waste going to the landfill. We are only going to talk about these briefly because I want to spend some time looking at sewage treatment. So two of the most common ways are recycling and composting. Now, you've been hearing about recycling probably your entire life. Composting may be a little bit new, but both of these can help reduce the volume in the landfill. Recycling, it's a great way for us to kind of reduce the demand on our natural resources and some of our minerals. However, it is pretty energy intensive and costly. So not only are we talking about having to simply sort and transport these materials to a recycling facility, but the facility itself is going to take some energy and some money to turn those methods or turn those substances into something new, so recycling it into a new product. Composting is a little bit different. So you're taking just the organic matter and you're using decomposition to turn that into fertilizer. So it can happen on industrial scales. You could have large industrial facilities taking lots of organic solid waste from a city and composting it, or it can happen in your backyard. You could take some of your organic waste from your kitchen scraps, let's say, or yard waste, and compost it in a pile. Now, we do have the downsides. They're a little similar to what we saw in the dump of the odor and the rodents, but there are ways to lessen those things. I know I particularly use at home, as well as in my classroom, vermicomposting, which is using earthworms, red wiggler earthworms, to help decompose. And every 6 months or so, I get these really great bags of worm castings, which are great fertilizers. So recycling and composting are two unique ways to reduce the volume of solid waste going into the landfill. So let's just do a quick check for understanding. I'll give you about 30 seconds to answer this question, please. So hopefully you saw that the incineration could lead to some air pollution. I now want to point out the 2016 FRQ about municipal solid waste. So it starts with a graph showing us the total municipal solid waste as well as per capita municipal solid waste from 1960 to 2012. There is a part A to this, which is more calculations, but I wanted us to focus on B through E. So B says, identify a disadvantage of waste incineration, and II, identify disadvantage of waste disposal in landfills. So you should be able to identify a negative consequence of both of those. And then we go into incineration, and this is the one I would like you to actually practice now. So C says, describe the steps of a process used to produce electricity from waste buried in a landfill. So again, note the task word describe, which means provide the relevant characteristics of a specific topic. Here, electricity generation from the waste buried in a landfill. So take 30 seconds and jot down on a piece of paper what you would answer for C. All right, so let's take a look at these answers here. So this is worth 3 points. It says 1 point for each step in the process of generating electricity from landfill gas. So there's 3 parts of this. So step number 1, get the methane, get the fuel. Step number 2, combust it, so producing that steam or hot air. And then finally, using that to generate electricity, going from mechanical to electrical energy. So that steam spins and rotates the turbine, then the generator to produce electricity. So our second big topic we're going to look at today is sewage treatment, wastewater treatment. So by the end of this little section, you should be able to really describe the best practices in sewage treatment. So to get there, we're going to go to a sewage treatment plant, a wastewater treatment facility, and we're going to look at the stages of wastewater treatment, of sewage treatment. So first is primary, second is secondary, third is tertiary, and then fourth step is disinfection. So we'll walk through each of these phases and give some examples and descriptions of each. So again, what happens after we flush? Most people really don't think about this too much, but for the vast majority of homes, this is going to go to a wastewater treatment plant or a sewage treatment plant. And it, again, just like the landfill, it has specific design features to make it operate properly and to minimize environmental impact. So let's take a look at those. So the first one is primary treatment, and this is physical. So you'll notice I underlined the word physical just to remind you that primary is physical. It's going to start with using a screen or a grate to filter out solid material. So this is going to be things like plastic, paper, somebody's toy, the car that they drop down the toilet, whatever it might be that's solid. These grates are going to really help to grab it before it goes into the wastewater treatment plant. And then we're going to let the water sit and settle. So we're going to take fast flowing water and slow it down and let it go move a little bit slower through the plant. And all of these particles that are in the wastewater, a lot of them can settle out. So again, we're not using any chemical or biological treatment here. This is all physical, filtering and settling. And then we go into secondary treatment, and this is when it becomes a zoo. So we've got all of this anaerobic bacteria that is going to now break down that organic material and turn it into sludge, which settles down into the bottom of the tank and can be taken elsewhere. But this is aerobic decomposition. Now, why do we have all these bubbles in here? That's really important to talk about, because if you remember from our conversation the other day on eutrophication, the point source pollutants coming into the stream is going to demand a lot of oxygen, because these microorganisms, these decomposers, really, really want a lot of oxygen. So what we see in this stream is the oxygen sags down, this oxygen sag curve, because the oxygen is being used up. So in order to make a wastewater treatment plant function purposefully, you're going to inject lots of air into this water. And then tertiary treatment is not one we're going to go into too much detail, but just know it is an advanced step to remove any additional pollutants and to grab out as much nitrogen and phosphorus content as possible. And then finally, before the water is discharged to wherever it's going to go, into a river or wherever it might go in your area, it needs to be disinfected. So we want to get rid of the bacteria that might be in that water. Common thing to use is chlorine. There are some environmental consequences of chlorine. So some places are using ozone or UV light. These are just large UV bulbs. And once they're lowered into the water stream, the wastewater flows through it and the bacteria is killed. So we're going to take a look at a clip from National Geographic. This is a quick tour of a wastewater treatment plant in England.
Waste from London's toilets, sinks and gutters is carried away by a network of interconnecting ever larger pipes designed and built by sewage superstar and pioneer Joseph Bazalgette. It all ends up here, a sewage treatment works.
This is Beckton Sewage Treatment Works in the east of London, and it's Europe's biggest. It was originally part of Joseph Bazalgette's scheme, but I tell you what, sewage treatment has really moved on since his day.
In the 19th century, sewage was simply stored here in tanks, then pumped out to the river at high tide. So you'll be pleased to know today's process is a lot more refined and takes just 4 hours for raw sewage to be clean enough to return to the river.
Every day, this treatment works handles the sewage from 3.4 million Londoners. Now, that's an astonishing volume. It equates to 34 Olympic swimming pools every hour.
So how does it treat the byproducts of our late-night beer sessions and trips to the local curry house?
The first process happens here at the inlet works. Using these screens, large lumps like bricks, wood, rags are raked out.
Once collected, these large objects will all be washed and sent to a landfill site nearby.
They've even had half a car here.
Meanwhile, the remaining sewage passes on to the next part of the process, into these primary settlement tanks.
Now, very basically, it enters at that end and flows relatively slowly this way.
Over the top of each tank is a moving bridge, which has 2 blades to remove solid organic material from the sewage. The top blade skims scum from the surface, while a second submerged blade dredges the heavier settled sludge from the bottom of the tank. All this solid sludge is then sent for further processing.
The remaining sewage then flows down this way towards the secondary biological treatment process.
And here it is. In these tanks, the sewage is mixed in with billions upon billions of bacteria, so all the dissolved materials that still remain can be biodegraded.
And pumping air.
So let's debrief now of what we just talked about. So our goals overall were to understand solid waste, where does our trash go? What are some methods that we could reduce the volume of solid waste going to that landfill? And then finally, sewage treatment, that primary, secondary, tertiary, and disinfectant stages in wastewater treatment. So let's look at some actual questions that you might be asked about wastewater treatment and solid waste. So just a reminder, really know those task verbs and try to figure out which each one is asking and how that kind of directs what you're going to write. So this one comes from the 2012 exam. This is FRQ number 4. It's a great review of our conversation from 2 videos ago about the wetlands. So it asks you to describe a wetland, to complete a little food web here in the middle, some economic benefits of a wetland, some specific human activities that might degrade the wetland. But I want us to focus on E down here, E at the very bottom. It says, wastewater treatment plants perform some of the same water quality improvement functions that natural wetlands perform. Explain how wetlands perform the equivalent of primary and secondary treatment. So keep in mind that the word explain is asking for a little bit more, so you should probably have a verb in your answer. So I'll give you a minute to jot down some ideas for I and II. All right, let's look at the answers here. So before we look at the actual answers, let's go back to a slide that I presented in the previous video. So looking at wetlands, they really do this physical treatment. They act almost like a speed bump, and they slow the water down before it enters into a larger body of water, and that stuff can settle out, just like we saw gravity settling out things in primary treatment. But it also does a biological process by which these plants, these marsh grasses, absorb nitrogen and phosphorus. So for EI, the answer would be 1 point for physical, mechanical, removing, trapping of sediments and solids and objects and particulates through processes such as settling, sedimenting, filtering, and screening. So Ms. Fassler mentioned the fact that explains typically want a verb. So there's a great verb use there. So secondary treatment is removal of this bacteria or biological action, breaking down and decomposing some of that organic material. So you should see some parallels between wastewater treatment plants and wetlands. So let's kind of go back to our visual representation skill. Remember that in the description we read the other day, wastewater treatment was one of the things explicitly mentioned in this skill. And just as a reminder, this skill really asks you to look at the pieces and parts of a visual model, then go into how are they related, and then finally, what does that model tell you? So it's going to go from simple to more complex. So here's a visual model of a wastewater treatment plant. So take 30 seconds and answer this question. All right, so hopefully you were able to see that if that air compressor were to malfunction, we would lose that bacterial action because the dissolved oxygen would not be there to support them. The next one I want to look at is FRQ number 1 from 2007. This is a great one, all about sewage treatment. So it really asks you to identify primary and secondary treatments, some pros and cons of everything. So it's a really great one to practice your knowledge about wastewater treatment or sewage treatment. However, I want us to focus on this one, on part E. So if you would, let's read this. It says the final step in sewage treatment is disinfection. Identify one pollutant that's targeted during disinfection and identify one commonly used method for disinfection. So let's take a look at these. I'm not going to ask you to do it now just for time's sake, but you should be able to identify some of the pollutants that we're getting out during disinfection, like bacteria or pathogens or other microorganisms. How do we do that? We mentioned chlorine, ozone, and UV radiation or UV lights as one method to do that. So hopefully at the end here, you can explain where does your toilet go and where does your trash go, and really look at the environmental consequences of those things and how the structures that we've built, a modern sanitary landfill and a wastewater treatment plant, work to address those. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.